Doolittle confessed to his sergeant that he was going to prison. He was standing in a Chinese rice paddy on the night of April 18, 1942, covered in mud and animal dung, and he had just led the most daring air raid in American history. 16 bombers launched from a Navy carrier. Every single one of them was destroyed. Not a single aircraft was recovered. He told Sergeant Paul Leonard that he knew what was going to happen, that he would be put in Leavenworth prison for having missed the mission. He was not being modest. He genuinely believed the mission had failed. He had lost all 16 planes, caused minimal damage to Tokyo, and sent 80 men on a flight he knew most of them might not survive. In his own words, he felt lower than a frog's posterior. He was 45 years old, held a doctorate from MIT, and had already broken more aviation records than any pilot alive, and he was certain his career was over. But here is what Doolittle did not know while he sat in that rice paddy. 600 miles to the east, inside the Imperial Japanese Navy's headquarters, Admiral Matome Ugaki was writing a single sentence in his war diary. Today, the victory belonged to the enemy. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the man who had planned Pearl Harbor, was so shaken that he locked himself in his cabin and handed command to his chief of staff. The Japanese military, which had believed its homeland was untouchable, was about to make the most catastrophic strategic decision of the entire Pacific War. And it would cost them 4 aircraft carriers, 248 planes, and over 3,000 men at a place called Midway. The man who expected a court-martial received the Medal of Honor instead. But to understand how that happened, we need to go back to the worst 5 months in American military history. Because the Doolittle Raid did not come from confidence. It came from desperation. On December 7, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and killed 2,403 Americans. But Pearl Harbor was only the beginning. In the 131 days between that attack and the Doolittle Raid, the Allies suffered an unbroken chain of disasters that made people genuinely fear the war was already lost. Guam fell on December 10th. Wake Island fell on December 23rd. Hong Kong surrendered on December 26th. Manila fell on January 2nd. Singapore, the fortress Churchill called impregnable, surrendered on February 15th with 85,000 troops captured. Churchill called it the worst disaster in British military history. The Dutch East Indies fell in March. Bataan surrendered on April 9th. 76,000 prisoners. Then came the Death March. Americans at home were terrified. Library of Congress interviews from early 1942 recorded widespread fear that Japanese or German bombers would hit American cities. President Roosevelt told his Joint Chiefs on December 21st, just 2 weeks after Pearl Harbor, that Japan must be bombed as soon as possible to boost public morale. But there was a problem that no one in the American military knew how to solve. No American weapon could reach Tokyo. Navy carrier planes had combat radii of 175 to 250 miles. Japanese air patrols extended roughly 300 miles offshore. Sailing a carrier close enough to launch meant putting it inside the kill zone of land-based bombers. And America had already lost too many ships to risk its last operational carriers on a suicide run. Army medium bombers had the range. A B-25 Mitchell could fly 1,300 miles. That was enough to reach Tokyo from far out at sea and continue to airfields in China. But a B-25 had a wingspan of 67 feet, weighed 28,000 pounds fully loaded, and had never in its existence taken off from an aircraft carrier. It certainly could never land on one. The Army had range but no launch platform. The Navy had a launch platform but no range. Both halves of the solution existed. They had just never been combined. Then, on January 10, 1942, a Navy captain named Francis Lowe flew to Norfolk, Virginia, to inspect the new carrier USS Hornet. At the Naval Air Station, he noticed something. Painted on the runway was the outline of a carrier flight deck used for landing practice. Flying directly over that painted outline were Army twin-engine bombers making simulated bombing passes. Lowe stared at the two things together, and his mind made the connection that would change the war. He rushed back to Washington and told Admiral Ernest King, "Sir, I have got an idea for bombing Japan." King replied, "Lowe, you might have something there." King ordered Captain Donald Duncan to evaluate whether it was physically possible to launch a B-25 from a carrier deck. Duncan produced a 30-page handwritten feasibility study. His conclusion was that only one aircraft fit the requirements, only one carrier had a deck wide enough, and the mission could only work in one direction. The bombers could take off. They could never come back. But the question of who would lead 80 men on a one-way mission into the heart of the Japanese Empire had already been answered. The Army Air Forces had a 45-year-old lieutenant colonel who had spent his entire career doing things other pilots said were impossible. Jimmy Doolittle was 5 feet 4 inches tall and had been the amateur West Coast bantamweight boxing champion by age 16. He had soloed an airplane after just 7 hours of instruction. He held a doctorate in aeronautical science from M1T. He had won the Schneider, Bendix, and Thompson Trophy air races, the only pilot in history to hold all three. In 1929, he performed the first completely blind instrument flight, taking off, navigating, and landing an aircraft entirely by instruments in a hooded cockpit. The safety pilot never touched the controls. General Hap Arnold, commander of the Army Air Forces, selected Doolittle to plan the mission. Doolittle was supposed to supervise from Washington. Instead, he lobbied relentlessly to lead it personally. On March 15th, he got permission, reportedly by running down a hallway to secure approval from one general before another could phone to block the request. The B-25 Mitchells needed to be transformed. 24 aircraft were modified at facilities in Minneapolis and Sacramento. The classified Norden bomb sight was removed and replaced with a 20-cent aiming device made from 2 pieces of aluminum, designed by Captain Ross Greening and nicknamed the Mark Twain. The lower gun turret was stripped out because, as Doolittle put it, a man could learn to play the violin well enough for Carnegie Hall before he could learn to fire that thing. In its place went a 60-gallon rubber fuel bladder. Extra fuel was the obsession. A 160-gallon collapsible tank went on top of the bomb bay. A 225-gallon rubber bladder filled the bomb bay itself. 10 5-gallon cans were stacked by the radio operator's station to be emptied by hand into the main tanks during flight, punctured, and thrown overboard. Total fuel capacity went from 646 gallons to 1,141. And in the tail cone, 2 painted broomstick handles were inserted through holes to simulate machine gun barrels. Each modified B-25 weighed approximately 31,000 pounds at launch, 2,000 pounds over the aircraft's maximum design load. The plane had no arresting hook, could not fit on the carrier's elevator, and could not be recovered under any circumstances. The crews knew this before they volunteered. Every single one of them did anyway. If you are finding this story as intense as I think you are, hit subscribe. I cover military history stories like this every week, and the second half of this one gets much darker. Volunteer crews from the 17th Bombardment Group arrived at Eglin Field in Florida in late February. Doolittle assembled roughly 140 men and told them this will be the most dangerous thing any of you have ever done. A Navy lieutenant named Hank Miller, who had never seen a B-25 in his life, taught Army pilots how to get airborne in 400 feet of runway. Within a week, Lieutenant Donald Smith achieved a record takeoff run of just 287 feet. By departure, every pilot could get airborne in 350 feet or less. On April 1st, 16 B-25s were craned aboard USS Hornet at Alameda, California. They filled the entire flight deck. The last bomber hung its twin rudders over the fantail. Hornet's own fighters and dive bombers were crammed into the hangar below, hung from the overhead in every available space. On April 2nd, Hornet steamed through the Golden Gate. No one aboard except Captain Mark Mitcher and a handful of officers knew the destination. That afternoon, Mitcher announced over the loudspeaker that this ship will carry the Army bombers to the coast of Japan for the bombing of Tokyo. The crew erupted in cheers. On April 13th, Hornet's group met Admiral William Halsey aboard USS Enterprise north of Midway. 16 warships formed Task Force 16 and turned west toward Japan under total radio silence. The plan called for launching 450 nautical miles from Tokyo at dusk, so the bombers would arrive over Japan in darkness. That plan lasted exactly 5 more days. At 7:38 in the morning on April 18th, lookouts on Hornet spotted a Japanese picket boat. Nito Maru, a 70-ton converted fishing vessel, was bobbing in heavy seas roughly 650 nautical miles from Japan, 170 miles farther than planned. The picket boat had a radio transmitter, and it used it. A warning went out to Japanese naval headquarters before the light cruiser Nashville could sink the vessel. It took Nashville 915 rounds of 6-inch shells to finish the little boat in those seas. Halsey had seconds to decide. The Japanese now knew an American carrier force was approaching. Every minute brought the possibility of air attack. At approximately 8 in the morning, he signaled USS Hornet with a message that read, "Launch planes to Colonel Doolittle and Gallant Command. Good luck and God bless you." Hornet's loudspeaker blared for Army pilots to man their planes for immediate takeoff. The official action report documented a high wind of over 40 knots and heavy swells that caused the carrier to pitch violently, with green water crashing over the bow and soaking the flight deck. Lieutenant Edgar Osborne, the Navy launch officer, stood at the bow with a checkered flag. His job was to time the ocean. He watched the carrier dip into a trough, began twirling the flag, and lunged forward to point at the bow the instant the ship hit bottom, so the aircraft would reach the deck edge just as the bow pitched upward. Doolittle launched first at approximately 8:20 in the morning, 467 feet of pitching, spray-drenched deck. A 28,000-pound bomber loaded to 31,000 pounds. Witnesses said the aircraft dropped below the flight deck edge before pulling up at the last second. All 16 bombers launched safely in 59 minutes. Not one was lost during takeoff. But the early launch had changed every fuel calculation the mission was built on. What had been a difficult one-way flight was now something closer to impossible. The bombers flew to Japan at wave-top height, so low that Doolittle later reported breaking up a baseball game in the Tokyo suburbs. They climbed to 1,200 feet for their bombing runs. Each aircraft carried 4 500-pound bombs, including incendiary clusters containing 128 small firebombs. 5 of the bombs had Japanese friendship medals wired to them, medals that had been awarded to American servicemen before the war. 10 bombers hit Tokyo. Others struck Yokohama, Nagoya, Kobe, and Osaka. The most significant military damage was a 26 by 50-foot hole blown through the hull of the submarine tender Taijie at Yokosuka Naval Base, delaying its conversion to a light carrier by 4 months. Not a single B-25 was shot down over Japan. The broomstick tail guns worked exactly as Doolittle hoped. He later confirmed that no airplane was attacked directly from behind. Japanese defenses had expected the American fleet to stay out of range until April 19th. They never imagined land-based bombers could launch from a carrier. 87 Japanese civilians were killed. 151 were seriously wounded. 1 student was killed by strafing at Mizumoto Primary School. The physical damage was negligible, but the damage that mattered had nothing to do with buildings or factories. It had to do with what happened inside the headquarters of the Imperial Japanese Navy when the bombs started falling. 15 bombers reached China. 1 diverted to the Soviet Union when its improperly serviced carburetors burned fuel at double the normal rate. Captain Edward York's crew landed at Vozdvichenka Air Base near Vladivostok and spent 13 months interned before a staged escape through Iran. Of the 15 aircraft that reached China, not one survived. 11 crews bailed out by parachute into mountains and darkness. 4 crash-landed or ditched at sea. The Chinese airfields that were supposed to guide them in with radio homing beacons had gone dark. The equipment plane had crashed. No alert signal was ever sent. When the B-25 bombers were heard overhead, Chinese airfield crews sounded air raid alarms and turned off every light. 3 raiders were killed. Corporal Leland Factor fell down a cliff after his parachute landed in mountainous terrain. Staff Sergeant William Dieter and Sergeant Donald Fitzmaurice drowned when their B-25 ditched in the sea off the China coast. 8 men from 2 crews were captured by the Japanese. They were tortured, tried under a retroactive law, and sentenced to death. On October 15, 1942, Lieutenants Dean Hallmark and William Farrow and Sergeant Harold Spatz were bound, blindfolded with white cloth bearing black targets on their foreheads, and shot by firing squad outside Shanghai. A 4th prisoner, Lieutenant Robert Meader, died of dysentery and starvation in December 1943. The 4 survivors endured 40 months of solitary confinement before liberation in August 1945. But the worst was yet to come. Japan launched a retaliatory campaign across Zhejiang and Jiangxi provinces with nearly 200,000 troops. The orders were to destroy every airfield and punish every civilian who had helped the American airmen. Father Wendelin Dunker, who witnessed the campaign, testified that the Japanese troops shot any man, woman, child, cow, hog, or just about anything that moved. Parachute silk and American nickels given as thank you gifts became death warrants. The city of Nanchang was razed entirely. Japan's biological warfare unit deployed nearly 300 pounds of plague, anthrax, and cholera agents across the region. An estimated 250,000 Chinese civilians were killed. Doolittle wrote in his autobiography that this was perhaps the greatest tragedy of our mission. And yet the raid accomplished something that no amount of physical destruction could have matched. It broke the myth that Japan's homeland was untouchable. Admiral Ugaki wrote in his diary that the victory belonged to the enemy. Yamamoto locked himself in his quarters. A Japanese officer named Kuroshima said the raid passed like a shiver over Japan. The emperor himself had to be personally reassured by the premier, the navy minister, and the foreign minister. Before the raid, Yamamoto had proposed attacking the American base at Midway Island to expand Japan's defensive perimeter. The Naval General Staff opposed it. The Army refused to cooperate. But after 16 Army bombers appeared over Tokyo, opposition evaporated overnight. The Naval History and Heritage Command states that the raid dissolved the residual doubts about whether a thrust against Midway should be attempted. The Japanese Army went along with the Navy's plan. 2 carriers were diverted to the Aleutian Islands to prevent their use as bomber bases. Yamamoto got his operation. And on June 4, 1942, at the Battle of Midway, the overextended Japanese fleet lost 4 aircraft carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu. 248 aircraft, over 3,000 dead. It was the turning point of the Pacific War. The Japanese Navy never recovered. When reporters pressed President Roosevelt on where the bombers had come from, he said they had launched from Shangri-La, the fictional paradise from James Hilton's novel Lost Horizon. The Navy later named an aircraft carrier USS Shangri-La in honor of the joke. Doolittle never saw his court-martial. Instead, he was promoted 2 full grades to brigadier general while still in China, skipping the rank of colonel entirely. Roosevelt presented him the Medal of Honor at the White House on May 19, 1942. He went on to command the 12th Air Force in North Africa, the 15th Air Force in the Mediterranean, and the 8th Air Force in Europe, where his decision to free escort fighters from close bomber protection was later credited by German fighter commander Adolf Galland as the moment Germany lost the air war. He retired as a lieutenant general and was promoted to 4-star general on the retired list in 1985. Every year after the war, the surviving Raiders gathered for a reunion. The city of Tucson, Arizona, presented 80 silver goblets, one for each man, each engraved with a name that could be read from both sides. Beside the goblets sat a bottle of 1896 Hennessy Cognac, matching Doolittle's birth year. At every reunion, they called the roll, toasted the men who had gone, and turned upside down the goblets of those who had died. The plan was simple. The last 2 survivors would open the bottle and drink the final toast. On November 9, 2013, at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, 3 surviving Raiders held the final public ceremony. Lieutenant Colonel Richard Cole, Doolittle's co-pilot in the lead bomber, broke the seal on the bottle and raised his glass. "Gentlemen," he said, "may I propose a toast to those we lost in the mission and to those who passed away since. May they rest in peace." Cole died on April 9, 2019, at age 103, the last of the 80. On the 80th anniversary of the raid, his children turned his goblet upside down. All 80 now rest inverted in their case. Jimmy Doolittle died on September 27, 1993, at age 96. He is buried at Arlington National Cemetery. In 2016, the United States Air Force announced that its new stealth bomber, the B-25, would be named Raider. Not after Special Operations Forces, not after a famous battle. After 16 bombers that were too heavy to land, launched from a deck that was too short, 170 miles too far away, in a mission so impossible that its own commander expected prison, and it changed the entire course of the Pacific War.